but instead centered on questions that cut to the core of American democracy, media credibility, and unresolved national scandals. What emerged over these days was a pattern of statements and actions that, taken together, revealed how power, information, and accountability are being contested at the highest levels of government, from comments about reshaping how elections are run in the United States, to renewed attention on long-sealed Jeffrey Epstein documents, to upheaval inside one of the country's most influential newspapers. The week formed a single, interconnected narrative that continues to ripple far beyond Washington. At the center of that narrative was President Trump's renewed call to federalize or nationalize U.S. elections, a proposal that immediately triggered alarm among election officials, constitutional scholars, and members of both political parties. Under the U.S. Constitution, states hold primary authority over how elections are conducted, and while Congress can set certain standards, the day-to-day administration has always remained decentralized. Trump's remarks, delivered in public comments and reinforced by aides, suggested a desire to shift that balance of power toward the federal government, citing claims of fraud and inconsistency. Critics argue that such a move would fundamentally alter the structure of American elections and could open the door to unprecedented federal intervention during future midterms. Legal experts were quick to note that nationalizing elections would face enormous constitutional hurdles, requiring either sweeping legislation or a constitutional amendment, neither of which appears remotely achievable in the current political climate. Yet the concern voiced by election officials was less about feasibility and more about intent. They warned that repeated messaging from the White House, questioning state-run elections, could undermine public trust and create justification for federal pressure on states ahead of closely contested races. Several secretaries of state emphasized that decentralization is a safeguard, not a flaw. As those debates unfolded, another issue resurfaced with striking force: a new release of files connected to Jeffrey Epstein. While many of the documents were technically unsealed, large portions remained heavily redacted, reigniting long-standing questions about who was protected and why. Survivors, advocates, and transparency groups criticized the selective nature of the disclosures, arguing that partial releases risk giving the appearance of accountability without delivering its substance. The renewed attention placed pressure on the administration to explain its position on disclosure, especially given Trump's past social and political proximity to figures mentioned in Epstein-related reporting. Inside the White House briefing room, questions about Epstein quickly became a flashpoint, particularly during exchanges with CNN correspondent Caitlin Collins. Her persistent questioning about the scope of the redactions and whether the administration supported full transparency prompted visible irritation from the president, who dismissed the topic and criticized the line of inquiry. The moment, captured on camera and replayed widely, underscored the tension between the press and the administration, and highlighted how unresolved scandals continue to collide with current governance, regardless of attempts to move the conversation elsewhere. While the White House sought to manage these controversies, a separate shockwave hit the media landscape itself. The Washington Post announced layoffs affecting roughly 1/3 of its workforce, a decision that sent tremors through newsrooms across the country. Long regarded as a pillar of investigative journalism, the paper cited financial pressures and shifting digital economics, but critics argued that the cuts threatened its ability to hold power to account at a moment when rigorous reporting is most needed. Journalists within the organization described a sense of uncertainty and loss, fearing that institutional memory and investigative capacity would be permanently diminished. The layoffs took on added significance because of their timing. As the administration faced scrutiny over elections, Epstein disclosures, and press relations, one of the most prominent institutions responsible for scrutinizing government power was being weakened. Media analysts noted that this convergence was not merely symbolic. Fewer reporters mean fewer resources to dig into complex stories, fewer watchdogs monitoring government actions, and greater reliance on official narratives. In that context, the layoffs became part of the broader story about how information flows are being reshaped in modern American politics, emphasizing policy priorities and dismissing criticism as partisan noise. Yet the combination of election centralization rhetoric, unresolved transparency demands, and media instability created an atmosphere of unease. Democratic lawmakers accused the administration of laying rhetorical groundwork for federal interference in future elections, while some Republicans privately expressed concern that the language being used could backfire legally and politically. Public trust, already fragile, appeared increasingly strained by the accumulation of unresolved questions. What stood out most was how these seemingly separate developments fed into one another. Election control debates raised fears about democratic norms. Epstein file controversies revived skepticism about elite accountability, and media layoffs weakened the very mechanisms designed to investigate both. Each story amplified the others, creating a feedback loop in which distrust became harder to contain. Analysts noted that this is how institutional stress often manifests, not through a single dramatic event, but through multiple pressures converging at once. By the end of the week, it was clear that the administration had not succeeded in closing the chapter on any of these issues. Questions surrounding Epstein documents remained unanswered, with redactions continuing to fuel suspicion. The Washington Post layoffs continued to spark debate about the future of journalism in a polarized and financially constrained environment. Together, they painted a picture of a political system grappling with legitimacy, transparency, and the durability of its democratic guardrails. As the country looks ahead to upcoming elections and ongoing investigations, the significance of this week lies less in any single headline and more in what it reveals about the state of American governance. Power is being tested, institutions are under strain, and the boundaries between politics, accountability, and information are being renegotiated in real time. The consequences of these debates will not be confined to Washington, but will shape public trust and democratic practice for years to come, long after the immediate news cycle has moved on.
As the implications of that week continue to unfold, attention has shifted from individual statements to the broader pattern they represent, because what concerns analysts most is not one proposal or one confrontation, but the cumulative effect of repeated challenges to long-standing democratic norms. When a sitting president questions state control of elections while simultaneously dismissing transparency demands and confronting the press, the signal sent to institutions is subtle but powerful. It suggests that norms once treated as settled are now open to reinterpretation, and that reinterpretation often favors central authority over distributed safeguards. Election officials across several states have responded by publicly reaffirming their constitutional role, emphasizing that decentralization is designed to prevent manipulation and coercion from any single source of power. They point out that while the system is imperfect, its fragmentation makes large-scale interference extraordinarily difficult. Critics of the president's rhetoric argue that portraying this system as broken creates justification for federal involvement that could fundamentally alter how elections function, especially during high-stakes midterm contests where margins are narrow and tensions high. At the same time, the renewed focus on Epstein-related documents has deepened skepticism about whether powerful individuals are ever fully held to account. Survivors and advocacy groups have stressed that transparency delayed is often justice denied, and that partial disclosures can erode confidence as much as secrecy itself. The administration's reluctance to engage deeply on the issue has kept it alive in the public discourse, ensuring that questions about who knew what and who was protected remain unresolved and politically potent. The press, caught between shrinking resources and expanding responsibilities, now faces a more difficult task than at any point in recent memory. With fewer reporters and editors, major outlets must decide which investigations to pursue and which to abandon, a triage that inevitably leaves gaps. Media scholars warn that these gaps are not neutral, because they tend to favor those already in power. When scrutiny diminishes, narratives become easier to control and accountability becomes harder to enforce. Inside the White House, officials have sought to frame criticism as partisan resistance rather than institutional concern, arguing that challenges to authority reflect political hostility rather than principled disagreement. Yet this framing has not fully resonated outside the administration's core supporters, independent legal experts, election administrators, and even some former allies have voiced unease, suggesting that the issues at stake transcend party lines and touch on the architecture of governance itself. What makes this moment particularly significant is the way it tests multiple systems at once. Elections test democratic legitimacy, transparency tests moral accountability, journalism tests the public's access to truth. When All three are under strain simultaneously. The margin for error narrows, small decisions carry larger consequences, and rhetoric that once might have been dismissed as symbolic takes on operational meaning. Looking ahead, much will depend on how institutions respond rather than how leaders speak. Courts may be asked to weigh in on the limits of federal authority over elections. Legislatures may face pressure to clarify disclosure standards and protect press freedoms. News organizations may be forced to reinvent models that allow investigative work to survive financial headwinds. None of these processes are quick and none produce immediate reassurance. For the public, the challenge lies in distinguishing between noise and substance, between spectacle and structure. Weeks like this one can feel overwhelming precisely because they touch on foundational questions without offering clear resolutions, yet it is in these moments that democratic systems are most visibly tested, not by dramatic collapse, but by sustained pressure. As the country moves forward, the legacy of this period will likely be measured not by a single headline, but by whether the institutions designed to distribute power, demand accountability, and inform citizens are able to adapt without surrendering their core principles. That outcome remains uncertain, and it is that uncertainty, more than any individual controversy, that defines the significance of what unfolded during this consequential week at the White House. That uncertainty now frames how the coming months are being interpreted by those inside and outside government, because the questions raised this week do not fade with the news cycle. They linger and shape expectations. Election officials are preparing not just for logistical challenges, but for legal and rhetorical ones, anticipating disputes that may arise from efforts to centralize authority or cast doubt on state-administered results. Their preparations reflect an understanding that trust, once eroded, is difficult to restore, and that preventive clarity matters as much as reactive defense. Within legal circles, the discussion has moved toward precedent and constraint, focusing on what mechanisms exist to prevent overreach regardless of who occupies the White House. Constitutional scholars emphasize that the durability of democratic systems depends less on individual restraint and more on institutional boundaries that function even when tested. From that perspective, the recent rhetoric has acted as a stress test, revealing both strengths and vulnerabilities in the current framework. The Epstein file controversy continues to operate on a parallel track, reminding the public how unresolved scandals can resurface and intersect with present power dynamics. Each new release, each redaction renews debate about transparency and accountability, particularly when outcomes appear uneven. The persistence of these questions underscores a broader cultural concern that justice may not be applied consistently, especially where wealth and influence are involved. Journalism's role in navigating these complexities remains essential but increasingly constrained. Reporters must now do more with less, verifying claims, contextualizing statements, and resisting pressure from all sides while operating under tighter financial limits. The Washington Post layoffs have become emblematic of this tension, serving as a reminder that the infrastructure supporting democratic oversight is not immune to market forces or internal upheaval. For audiences, this convergence of issues demands sustained attention rather than episodic outrage. Democratic systems rarely fail in dramatic moments. They weaken through gradual normalization of strain. Each challenge to norms, each unresolved question, each reduction in oversight contributes incrementally to that process. Recognizing this pattern is crucial to understanding why weeks like this one matter beyond their immediate headlines. As political actors position themselves for upcoming contests, the themes that surfaced here are likely to recur, shaping campaigns, policy debates, and institutional responses. Whether the system absorbs this pressure or bends under it will depend on how firmly its foundational principles are defended by those entrusted with their care. In that sense, the significance of this week lies not in its controversies alone, but in what it reveals about the current state of American democracy. A system still functioning, still contested, and still dependent on the balance between power and accountability.
That balance between power and accountability will now be tested not by words spoken at podiums, but by decisions made quietly in offices, courtrooms, and newsrooms, far from the spectacle that usually defines political conflict. What analysts are watching closely is whether institutional responses remain consistent once public attention shifts elsewhere. Because endurance, not reaction, is what ultimately determines democratic resilience. Moments like this expose whether safeguards are structural or merely customary, and whether they function independently of who benefits from them. In the case of election governance, the coming period will likely bring renewed legal clarity as states, courts, and federal agencies delineate their respective roles. Officials have already begun documenting procedures, reinforcing bipartisan oversight mechanisms, and communicating transparently with voters to counter uncertainty. These actions may not generate headlines, but they form the practical backbone of electoral legitimacy. Their effectiveness will be measured not by rhetoric, but by whether confidence holds when the system is next put under stress. The Epstein-related disclosures, meanwhile, continue to represent an unresolved moral reckoning. Each parcel release reinforces the perception that full transparency remains elusive, keeping public skepticism alive. Legal experts note that the longer questions remain unanswered, the more they erode confidence in institutions meant to deliver equal justice. This lingering discomfort has become part of the political environment, influencing how new controversies are interpreted and how official explanations are received. Within journalism, the consequences of contraction are still unfolding. Fewer investigative teams mean longer timelines, narrower scopes, and greater reliance on external sources. Yet journalists remain acutely aware of their responsibility, particularly during periods when official power is contested. The challenge ahead is not only financial survival, but preserving credibility and depth in an era when misinformation thrives on gaps left by reduced reporting capacity. What ties these threads together is a shared reliance on trust in elections, trust in accountability, trust in information. Once strained, trust does not rebound easily. It requires consistent behavior over time, reinforced by institutions acting predictably and transparently. This is why observers emphasize continuity over crisis, watching how decisions made now influenced expectations later. As the administration moves forward, it will encounter a political landscape shaped by these dynamics, where skepticism is heightened and scrutiny intensified. Whether that scrutiny leads to reform, retrenchment, or further polarization remains an open question. What is certain is that the events of this week have added weight to ongoing debate about how American democracy functions under pressure. Ultimately, the story is not about a single proposal, confrontation, or newsroom decision. It is about how interconnected systems respond when challenged simultaneously, and whether they can maintain their core principles while adapting to changing realities. The answers will emerge gradually, through actions rather than announcements, and through outcomes rather than intentions. Those outcomes will likely shape how this period is remembered, not as a moment of sudden rupture, but as a phase in which long-standing assumptions were quietly tested. Political systems often reveal their true strength not during moments of consensus, but during periods of friction, when competing pressures pull institutions in different directions. What has become evident is that the machinery of governance is being asked to operate under sustained scrutiny, with little margin for error and even less tolerance for ambiguity. For election systems, this means that clarity and consistency will be essential in the months ahead. Administrators are aware that even small procedural changes can be magnified into narratives of manipulation or bias. As a result, many are prioritizing transparency over efficiency, choosing to document and explain processes in greater detail than before. This deliberate approach reflects an understanding that public confidence depends as much on perception as on performance, especially in a polarized environment. The unresolved nature of the Epstein disclosures continues to function as a reminder of past failures, influencing how current assurances are evaluated. When explanations feel incomplete, they invite speculation, and speculation fills the space left by silence. This dynamic places additional pressure on officials to demonstrate openness, even when legal constraints limit what can be released. The tension between due process and public demand for answers remains unresolved, and its persistence affects broader debates about accountability. In media organizations, the task of navigating these overlapping issues has become more complex. Journalists are not only reporting on events, but also explaining systems, laws, and institutional roles to audiences who may feel increasingly disconnected from them. The reduction in newsroom capacity makes this task more challenging, yet also more critical. Each story carries greater weight, as fewer voices are available to provide context or correction. What emerges from this convergence is a heightened awareness that democratic systems are interdependent. Elections rely on trust in administration. Accountability relies on transparency. Transparency relies on a functioning press. When pressure is applied to one element, the effects are felt across the others. Understanding this interconnectedness is key to interpreting why developments that might once have seemed isolated now resonate more broadly. As attention inevitably shifts to future contests and policy battles, the lessons of this week will remain embedded in institutional memory. Decisions made now about how power is exercised and how information is shared will inform responses to challenges yet to come. Whether those responses reinforce stability or deepen division will depend on the choices of individuals operating within systems designed to outlast them. In this sense, the significance of what unfolded lies not in immediate resolution, but in the ongoing process of adjustment. Democracy does not announce its turning points with certainty. They are recognized later, through reflection, when patterns become clear and consequences visible. What is being observed now is one such pattern taking shape, quietly, under sustained observation.
शॉपिफाई की तरफ से लें।
Shopify, best e-commerce, drop shipping. क्या कर रहे हो?
ये एक एक्सपीरियंस करके देख रहे हैं, कामयाब हो जाता है क्या।
कल एक व्लॉग शूट करके लाऊंगा, देखता हूँ कैसा बनता है मुस्तफ़ा के मोबाइल में ना। और अगर ऐसा होता है ना तो फिर लैपटॉप को बेच के मोबाइल ही पकड़ते हैं, उसमें करेंगे काम। व्लॉग्स बनाएंगे।
व्लॉगिंग ये है कि आप कैमरे के आगे आ जाओ तो व्लॉगिंग का मसला ही नहीं है कोई।
ऐसे बाबा अस्सलामुअलैकुम गाइस, जैसे कि आप देख रहे हैं हम व्लॉग शूट कर रहे हैं, तो ताकि हम आपको आगे चल के बात में बताएंगे। यही तो है ना, एक व्लॉग बनाने के लिए भी ना एक वो चाहिए, दिमाग
चाहिए, बात करना,
हाँ।
लोगों को समझाना कि हम क्या बोलेंगे, क्या करना चाहिए यूट्यूब के बारे में, हर चीज़। माना व्लॉगिंग करने के लिए थोड़ा सा जज्बा चाहिए जो हमारे पास कम है।
जज्बा ही तो नहीं है ना,
कैमरे के आगे आना, कैमरे के आगे ऐसे बात करना। हाँ भाई, यूट्यूब
फेस टू
फेस
जैसे यूट्यूब को हम समझा रहे हैं।
हाँ, फाड़ता हुआ जाएगा भाई ये।